My name is Ava Scott. I'm 28 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I was destined to fail because that's exactly what my sister told me every single day. She had this way of looking at me with pity mixed with superiority, repeating those words like a mantra. You'll fail like always, Ava. I carried that label like a second skin, letting it define every decision I made, every dream I buried before it could even take root. But what she didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that I was about to discover something that would flip our entire world upside down. And when I finally moved into my $3 million penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the look on her face was worth every single tear I'd cried. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you've ever been told you weren't good enough by the people who were supposed to lift you up, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is about to show you what happens when you stop believing their lies and start writing your own truth. You're probably wondering how someone who was labeled the family failure ended up in a penthouse that costs more than most people see in a lifetime. And trust me, this journey wasn't about luck or some sudden windfall that fell into my lap. This is a story about betrayal so calculated it took my breath away, about family members who built their confidence on the foundation of my supposed weakness, and about the moment I realized that everything I'd been told about myself was a carefully constructed lie. The truth is, I wasn't weak at all. I was being kept weak. And there's a massive difference between those two things that took me years to understand. What I'm about to share with you changed not just my bank account, but the entire way I see myself, my family, and what it means to break free from a narrative that was never mine to begin with. This isn't just another revenge story where someone gets back at their family for being mean, because what happened to me goes so much deeper than hurt feelings or sibling rivalry that got out of hand. What I uncovered was systematic, intentional, and designed to keep me in a box so small I could barely breathe. And when I finally saw the truth in black and white, something inside me shifted forever. So buckle up, because by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why some families don't celebrate your success. They fear it. And you're going to see what happens when the person they underestimated finally discovers her power. For years, I confused being gentle with being weak because those two things were constantly linked together in my household, as if having a soft heart automatically meant I couldn't handle the real world or make tough decisions. My sister Claire, 3 years older and infinitely more confident, or so it seemed, had this way of turning my kindness into evidence of my incompetence, pointing out every time I chose empathy over aggression as proof that I'd never make it in life. I remember being 16 and crying over a friend's problem, and Claire walked into my room, rolled her eyes, and said, "This is exactly why you'll never be successful, Ava. You care too much about things that don't matter." If you've ever had someone twist your strengths into weaknesses, make sure you're subscribed, because what I'm about to reveal will show you why they do it. And honestly, I started believing her because when you hear something enough times from someone who's supposed to know you, it starts to sound like truth even when every cell in your body knows it's wrong. Being underestimated became my normal, and the worst part wasn't just that my family saw me as less capable. It was that I eventually started seeing myself through their eyes, making decisions based not on what I wanted, but on what I thought I could handle given my supposed limitations. Every time I mentioned a goal or a dream, there was this subtle exchange of glances between Claire and my parents, this silent communication that said, "Oh, here she goes again with another thing she won't finish." I'd get excited about a business idea, and Claire would say, "That's cute, but you know you don't have the follow-through for something like that." And my parents would nod along, as if that was just an accepted fact about who I was. The crazy thing is that I started preemptively giving up on things before I even tried them, telling myself it was better to not start than to prove them right by failing, which is exactly the prison they wanted me to live in. What I didn't realize then was that this wasn't accidental commentary or honest concern. This was strategy, and I was the target. But here's what nobody tells you about being labeled the weak one in your family. That label doesn't just describe how they see you. It describes how they need you to be, because your small size makes them feel bigger. I didn't understand this dynamic until much later, when I could finally step back and see the whole picture with clear eyes. But looking back now, every put-down and every dismissive comment served a purpose in maintaining a hierarchy where I stayed at the bottom. My sister needed me to fail because my success would have disrupted the story she'd been telling about herself her entire life, the one where she was the capable one, the smart one, the one who had it all figured out. And my parents? They'd invested so much into Claire's narrative that admitting I might be capable would have meant acknowledging they'd been wrong about me all along, which is a truth most parents aren't willing to face. But narratives can be broken, and sometimes the truth hiding in old boxes and forgotten documents has the power to shatter everything people thought they knew about you. and themselves. Growing up, the worst part wasn't the loud arguments. It was the quiet, constant erosion of my confidence that happened in small, almost invisible ways. Claire had this habit of turning every family dinner into a subtle performance where she was the star and I was the punchline, and somehow everyone else just played along. If I mentioned anything I was proud of, an essay, a project, even a recipe I tried, she'd smirk and say something like, "Wow, Ava actually finished something? Mark the calendar." If this is already reminding you of someone in your life, hit subscribe and leave a like, because what comes next will show you just how deep this kind of joking can really cut. The room would fill with uncomfortable laughter, and I'd sit there smiling, pretending it didn't bother me while my stomach twisted into knots. Over time, those jokes became a script that everyone followed without question, and I slowly realized I had been assigned the role of the one who never got it right. When my parents wanted to motivate Claire, they'd say, "You're our responsible one. You're not like Ava," as if I was some kind of walking cautionary tale. Even my small wins were reframed as accidents or flukes. If I got a good grade, it was because the test was easy, not because I worked hard. I started doing this thing where I'd downplay everything I did, almost apologizing for existing, because the less attention I drew to myself, the fewer opportunities there were for Claire to embarrass me. And the sickest part? I thought this was just normal sibling banter, something everyone went through. The humiliation wasn't always verbal either. Sometimes it was in the looks, the sighs, the way Claire would shake her head when I spoke, like she was already exhausted by my existence. At birthdays or holidays, she'd tell these stories about my fails in front of extended family, like the time I dropped out of a community college class when I was 19. And everyone would nod as if this confirmed something they'd always suspected about me. I became the family anecdote, the tragic example of wasted potential, even though nobody had ever actually given me space or support to grow. It felt like I was wearing an invisible collar that said "not capable," and every time I tried to step forward, that collar yanked me right back. Little did I know, that collar wasn't just emotional. It was tied to something much more concrete and deliberate than I ever imagined. There's a special kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to prove yourself to people who have already decided you're a disappointment, and that's the exhaustion I woke up with almost every single day. I remember being in my early 20s, trying to start a small online business selling custom art prints, and when I told Claire about it, she laughed and said, "Ava, you can't even commit to a workout routine. What makes you think you can run a business?" Before I go on, make sure you're subscribed and drop a like if you've ever had someone talk you out of believing in yourself before you even got started, because those words sink deeper than you think. I shut my laptop that night and didn't touch that idea again for months, convincing myself she was just being realistic. Every attempt at growth became another piece of evidence for Claire and my parents to use against me, whether it worked out or not. If I tried something and it didn't go perfectly, Claire would say, "See, this is what I mean. You never think things through." And my mom would chime in with, "We just don't want you to be disappointed again, honey," like they were protecting me from myself. Even when things did go right, they'd find a way to dim the light. "Are you sure you can keep this up? Don't get your hopes too high." It wasn't just that they doubted me, it was that they seemed invested in me doubting myself, and that realization made me feel like there was something fundamentally broken inside me that everyone could see but me. I stopped sharing my ideas, my plans, even my thoughts, because it felt safer to be silent than to hand them more ammunition. Slowly, my world shrank. I stopped dreaming big dreams because dreaming hurt too much when every dream was met with sarcasm or skepticism. I took low-paying, low-responsibility jobs because I told myself that was my level, that I wasn't built for more complicated things like Claire was with her corporate career and her constant bragging about promotion. When friends asked why I didn't push for more, I'd shrug and say, "I'm just not that type of person," repeating words that weren't originally mine but had been planted there over years of repetition. Deep down, though, there was a quiet, restless part of me that didn't fully buy into the defective piece narrative, a part that kept asking, "What if they're wrong about you?" That question would haunt me for years, until the day I found the documents that proved my so-called failures were not just personal flaws, but the result of something much darker happening behind my back. I wasn't looking for anything life-changing the day I found those papers. Honestly, I was just cleaning out my late grandmother's storage unit because nobody else wanted to deal with it. My parents had asked me to handle it, probably because they figured the failure daughter had nothing better to do with her Saturday, and I'd been sorting through boxes of old photo albums, vintage clothing, and dusty books for hours when I found a locked metal box shoved in the back corner. The lock was rusted and broke easily when I pried it with a screwdriver, and inside were stacks of legal documents, letters with my grandmother's handwriting, and envelopes with my name printed across them in official-looking font. If you're watching this wondering what could possibly be in those papers, hit that subscribe button and leave a like, because what I'm about to tell you will blow your mind. This wasn't just some sentimental family keepsake. My hands started shaking as I pulled out the first document, a trust agreement dated back to when I was 17, and I saw my name listed as the primary beneficiary of my grandmother's estate. The more I read, the less sense everything made because according to these documents, my grandmother had set up a substantial trust fund specifically for me, not for Claire, not split between us, but for me alone. There were letters she'd written explaining why. She'd watched me grow up with a gentle spirit and creative mind, and she wanted to make sure I had financial security to pursue my passion without the pressure of failing that she'd seen my family put on me. I sat on that cold storage unit floor reading her words, tears streaming down my face, as she described me as thoughtful, artistic, and full of untapped potential, all the things my family had convinced me I wasn't. The trust was supposed to be released to me when I turned 21, with clear instructions that I was to be informed of it on my 18th birthday so I could plan accordingly. But here I was, 28 years old, sitting in a storage unit, finding out about money that had been mine for 7 years, money that nobody had ever mentioned to me even once. My mind raced through every conversation, every moment when I'd struggled to pay rent, every time Claire had helped me financially while reminding me how irresponsible I was with money. The trust wasn't just a small safety net either. We're talking about enough money to completely change someone's life, to start businesses, buy property, invest in education, do all the things I'd been told I was too incompetent to handle. I found letters from lawyers addressed to my parents' house, correspondence about the trust management, quarterly statements showing growth and interest accumulating in an account I'd never known existed. And then I found something that made my blood run cold. A letter from my mother to the estate lawyer, written 9 years ago, requesting that information about the trust be delayed until I was more mature and capable of handling such responsibility. The lawyer had pushed back, citing my grandmother's explicit wishes, but eventually, there was a final letter agreeing to manage the funds on Ava's behalf until further notice. They'd all known, and they'd decided I was too much of a failure to be trusted with my own inheritance. The weight that crushed my chest in that moment wasn't about the money itself. It was about the deliberate, calculated silence that had surrounded it for almost a decade of my adult life. I sat there on that concrete floor, surrounded by boxes and dust, and I felt like every conversation I'd ever had with my family was suddenly rewritten in my mind with horrible new context. Every time Claire had called me irresponsible, every time my parents had suggested I wasn't ready for big decisions, every time they'd treated me like a child who couldn't be trusted, it wasn't because I'd proven myself incapable. Make sure you're subscribed because this next part is going to show you just how deep family betrayal can go. And drop a like if you're already feeling that gut punch I felt in that storage unit. It was because keeping me small, keeping me dependent, keeping me believing I was a failure served them in some twisted way I was only beginning to understand. I drove home in a daze, those documents in a folder on my passenger seat, and I kept replaying moments from the past 7 years with this new, sickening clarity. The time I'd asked my parents for a small loan to take a graphic design course, and they'd said no because I never finished anything, while sitting on information about a trust fund with my name on it. The time Claire had made a big show of paying for my car repair and then brought it up at family dinners for months as evidence of how she always had to bail me out when there was money that was legally mine just sitting there. The time I'd applied for a management position and my mom had said, "Honey, maybe aim for something more your speed," discouraging me from growth while managing assets that my grandmother had specifically set aside to help me grow. Every memory was poisoned now, infected with the knowledge that my struggles hadn't been inevitable results of my own shortcomings. They'd been manufactured, maintained, and manipulated by the people who claimed to love me. But what hurt more than anything wasn't even the money they'd kept from me. It was the narrative they'd built using my financial struggles as proof that I was exactly what they said I was. They'd watched me work 3 part-time jobs to make rent, watched me stress about student loans, watched me turn down opportunities because I couldn't afford them. And instead of telling me about resources that were mine by right, they'd used my poverty as evidence of my incompetence. I thought about all the times I'd believed I was the problem, the times I'd looked in the mirror and seen a failure staring back. And I realized that image had been carefully cultivated by people who needed me to stay down. My grandmother had seen something in me worth investing in, worth protecting, worth believing in. And my family had decided her judgment was wrong and that they knew better. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to announce what I'd found, I wasn't going to confront them yet, and I definitely wasn't going to ask for their permission or approval. For the first time in my life, I was going to take what was mine and see who I could become when nobody was holding me back. The morning after I found those documents, I woke up feeling like a completely different person, not because anything external had changed, but because something fundamental had shifted inside me. For the first time in my entire life, I understood that my so-called weaknesses weren't character flaws. They were convenient labels that kept a system running smoothly, a system where Claire got to be the golden child and I got to be the cautionary tale. I sat at my tiny kitchen table in my cramped apartment, staring at those papers spread out in front of me, and I made a choice that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. I was going to use what was rightfully mine, and I wasn't going to tell a single person in my family until it was too late for them to interfere. If you've ever reached that moment where you realize you have to save yourself because nobody else is coming, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a like, because what happens next is about to show you what's possible when you finally bet on yourself. The silence I chose wasn't about revenge yet. It was about protection, about creating space where I could figure out who Ava actually was without Claire's voice in my head, telling me who I wasn't. I contacted the estate lawyer whose name was on the documents, and after proving my identity and going through what felt like 1,000 security questions, I learned the full scope of what my grandmother had left me. The trust had grown significantly over the years. We're talking about enough money to completely restart my life, to invest in real opportunity, to build something substantial if I was smart and careful about it. The lawyer seemed almost relieved to finally be speaking with me directly, and she mentioned, very carefully, that there had been concerns about the delay in informing me, but that my parents had assured her office I was going through a difficult period and needed time. That phrase, going through a difficult period, had apparently been their excuse for 7 years. 7 years of keeping me in the dark, while they controlled assets that were never theirs to control. I authorized the transfer of funds into a new account that only I had access, and I walked out of that lawyer's office feeling like I'd just been handed the keys to a life I didn't know I was allowed to have. The hardest part wasn't accessing the money. It was sitting across from my family at Sunday dinner 2 days later, watching Claire brag about her latest promotion while my parents beamed with pride and not saying a single word about what I knew. My mom asked me how my little job at the coffee shop was going, with that same patronizing tone she always used, and I just smiled and said, "It's fine, keeping me busy." Claire made some comment about how I should really think about going back to school for something practical, and I nodded like I always did. While inside, I was thinking about the consultation I'd scheduled with a financial advisor and the list of investment properties I'd started researching. They had no idea that the person sitting at that table wasn't the same Ava who'd walked in, that I'd already started planning a future so different from what they imagined for me that it would shatter every assumption they'd ever made. And honestly, the power in that silence, in knowing something they didn't, in holding cards they didn't even know were in play, that felt better than any confrontation could have in that moment. Within 3 weeks of accessing the trust, I'd done something I never thought I'd have the courage to do. I gave notice at all my jobs, packed up my apartment, and moved to a different city 2 hours away, where nobody knew me as Claire's struggling little sister. The freedom of starting over in a place where I had no reputation to live down, no family narrative hanging over me like a dark cloud, felt like taking the first real breath of my entire adult life. I found a modest but comfortable apartment in a neighborhood full of coffee shops and art galleries, the kind of place I'd always dreamed of living, but had convinced myself was not for people like me, and I set up a space that was completely mine. No hand-me-down furniture from Claire, no gifts from my parents that came with unspoken strings attached. Before I continue with what happened next, make sure you're subscribed and drop a like if you've ever had to physically distance yourself from family to finally hear your own thoughts clearly. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, except that I was trying something new, which my family took as more evidence of my flightiness rather than the calculated escape plan it actually was. For the first time in my life, I had space to think without someone immediately telling me why my thoughts were wrong or impractical or so typical of you, Ava. I started investing in myself in ways I'd never been able to before. I took business courses, hired a career coach, attended networking events where I introduced myself without the baggage of my family's expectations, weighing down every word. I discovered that when you're not constantly defending yourself against criticism, you have so much more energy for actually building things, for taking risks, for learning from mistakes, without someone turning those mistakes into permanent character judgment. My financial advisor helped me create a diversified portfolio, and I started learning about real estate investment, stock markets, business development, all these things Claire had always implied were too complex for someone like. Turns out, I wasn't too stupid to understand them. I just never had access to them or encouragement to try. The most surprising thing about this period wasn't the financial growth, though that was significant. It was discovering personality traits I didn't know I had because they'd been suppressed for so long. Without Claire's constant interruptions, I realized I was actually pretty decisive and could make choices quickly when I trusted my own judgment. Without my parents' worried hovering, I found I was comfortable with calculated risks and could handle setbacks without falling apart. I made friends who saw me as capable and interested, who asked for my opinions and actually listened to my answers. And it was jarring to realize how different their perception of me was from my family. These people didn't know I was supposed to be a failure, so they just treated me like a normal person with strengths and weaknesses, potential and limitations like everyone else. And in that environment, something incredible happened. I started to thrive in ways that would have been impossible if I'd stayed in that town, in that apartment, in that version of myself that my family needed me to be. Living without the constant weight of my family's judgment was like learning to walk without ankle weights I didn't even know I'd been wearing my entire life. I started noticing small things first, like how I'd stop second-guessing every decision I made, how I could try something new without that voice in my head, which sounded suspiciously like Claire, telling me I'd inevitably mess it up. I joined a women's entrepreneurship group where everyone was building businesses and supporting each other. And when I shared my ideas, people actually got excited instead of finding reasons why they wouldn't work. If you've ever felt yourself come alive when you're finally around people who believe in you, hit subscribe and leave a like because this transformation is about to get even more dramatic. Within months, I'd launched a small online business creating custom digital artwork for brands, something I'd dreamed about for years, but had never pursued because Claire had convinced me the market was too saturated and I didn't have the skills to compete. The business didn't become an overnight success, and honestly, I made plenty of mistakes in those early months. Pricing things wrong, taking on clients who weren't a good fit, struggling with time management and marketing strategy. But here's what was different. Those mistakes didn't define me or prove I was fundamentally incapable like they would have in my old life. Instead, they were just data points, learning experiences I could adjust and improve from without someone standing over my shoulder saying, "See, I told you this would happen." I had a mentor from the entrepreneurship group, a woman named Jessica, who'd built a successful consulting firm. And when I'd tell her about something that went wrong, she'd say things like, "Okay, so what did you learn? And how will you approach it differently next time?" It sounds simple, but that response, treating failure as information rather than identity, was completely foreign to me and absolutely transformative. My confidence grew in this quiet, steady way that I'd never experienced before, not the loud performative confidence Claire always displayed, but something deeper and more sustainable. I started trusting my instincts about people, about opportunities, about which risks were worth taking and which weren't. And I realized my judgment was actually pretty solid when I wasn't constantly being told it was faulty. The business started gaining traction, and I reinvested profits wisely, diversified my income streams, and built something that was genuinely mine in every sense of the word. My financial advisor was impressed with how quickly I picked up investment strategies, and she mentioned that I had a natural aptitude for seeing patterns and opportunities, which was hilarious considering my family had spent decades implying I couldn't even balance a checkbook. The trust fund my grandmother left me had given me the foundation, but this growth, this success, this version of myself who could handle complexity and responsibility, that was all me, built in the space where criticism couldn't reach me and where my potential finally had room to breathe. About 8 months into my new life, I made the decision to invest a significant portion of the trust fund into real estate, specifically a condo development project that my research and advisors suggested had tremendous potential. It was terrifying to commit that much money to something, and I spent weeks analyzing every angle, consulting experts, running numbers until my eyes blurred, but ultimately I trusted myself and pulled the trigger. The old Ava would have called my parents or asked Claire's opinion and then talked herself out of it based on their inevitable skepticism. But the new Ava understood that sometimes the best decisions are the ones you make in the quiet confidence of your own judgment. Make sure you're subscribed and drop a like if you know what it feels like to bet big on yourself for the first time, because what happened next validated every ounce of faith I'd put into this new version of my life. The investment paid off beyond my projection, and suddenly I wasn't just financially stable, I was building actual wealth. the kind that creates options and freedom and security for decades to come. But the financial reconstruction was only half the story. The emotional work I was doing was equally important and honestly much harder. I started therapy with a psychologist who specialized in family dynamics and narcissistic systems, and sessions were brutal in the most necessary way as I unpacked years of gaslighting, manipulation, and emotional abuse disguised as concern or honesty. My therapist helped me see patterns I'd been blind to, how Claire's put-downs always came right when I was feeling good about something, how my parents' worry conveniently appeared whenever I was about to take a step toward independence, how the family narrative required me to stay small so everyone else's roles made sense. I grieved the childhood I didn't have, the support I deserved but never received, the years I'd spent believing I was the problem, when really I was just the scapegoat in a dysfunctional family system. That grief was heavy and complicated because you can't just hate people who also gave you good memories and moments of genuine love, but you also can't ignore the damage they did by prioritizing their comfort over your growth. Through therapy and the distance I'd created, I started rebuilding my sense of self from the ground up, choosing which values were actually mine versus which ones I'd absorbed from a family that didn't have my best interests at heart. I learned to set boundaries I'd never known I was allowed to have, to say no without elaborate justifications, to pursue things because I wanted them, rather than to prove something to people who'd never believe in me anyway. My business continued growing, my investments were performing well, and I was building a life that reflected who I actually was rather than who I'd been told to be. I made genuine friendships with people who appreciated my kindness without seeing it as weakness, who valued my creativity without dismissing it as impractical, who celebrated my wins without trying to diminish them. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, I reconstructed both my bank account and my self-worth into something solid, something real, something that couldn't be shaken by Claire's sarcasm or my parents' doubt because it was built on truth rather than their convenient fiction. 18 months after finding those documents in my grandmother's storage unit, I stood in a luxury penthouse on the 42nd floor of a high-rise in the heart of the city, looking out at a view that stretched for miles in every direction, and I knew this was it. The realtor, a sharp woman named Michelle, was watching my face carefully as I walked through the space, floor-to-ceiling windows, a chef's kitchen with marble countertops, a master suite bigger than my first apartment, a private terrace with a glass railing that made you feel like you were floating above the world. The asking price was $3 million, which would have seemed absolutely insane to the old Ava, the one who'd counted pennies and stressed about rent, but this Ava had built a portfolio that made this purchase not just possible, but smart. If you're watching this thinking, there's no way this is, hit that subscribe button and leave a like because I promise you every word of this is true. And seeing the look on certain people's faces when they found out made every risk I took worth it. I didn't buy this penthouse to show off. I bought it because I could. Because it was a good investment, and because it represented everything I'd been told I'd never achieve. The day I signed the paperwork, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the pen. Not from fear, but from the sheer enormity of what this moment meant. This wasn't just a real estate transaction, this was a declaration, a physical manifestation of how completely I'd rewritten the story my family had written for me. I thought about my grandmother as I signed, wondering if she could somehow see this, if she knew that the faith she'd placed in me, the faith my family had tried to bury, had been the seed that grew into all of this. The trust fund had been the foundation, but everything built on top of it was mine. The business I'd grown from scratch, the investments I'd researched and chosen, the skills I'd developed, the confidence I'd painstakingly reconstructed piece by piece. Michelle congratulated me as I handed back the signed documents, and she mentioned that at 29, I was one of the youngest solo buyers she'd ever worked with at this price point, which made me smile because that's exactly the kind of thing Claire would have said was impossible for someone like me. Moving into that penthouse felt surreal in the best possible way, like I was living in a life that belonged to someone else, except it didn't. It belonged to me, earned by me, chosen by me. I furnished it slowly and deliberately, picking pieces that reflected my actual taste rather than what I could afford or what someone else thought was appropriate for me. I created a home office with everything I needed to run my growing business, a studio space for my artwork, a living area designed for the gatherings I planned to host with my new friends who actually enjoyed my company. Every room was a statement that I was capable, that I was worthy, that I belonged in spaces like this, despite every message I'd received growing up. And as I sat on my terrace that first night, watching the city lights flicker below me while sipping wine from an actual wine glass instead of a coffee mug, I felt something I'd never fully experienced before. Pride without guilt, success without the need to diminish it, happiness without waiting for someone to explain why I didn't deserve it. I'd been living in the penthouse for about 3 weeks when Claire showed up unannounced on a Saturday afternoon, which should have been impossible since the building had strict security and a doorman who wasn't supposed to let anyone up without resident approval. Apparently, she'd told the doorman she was my sister and that it was a family emergency, playing on people's assumptions that family always means well, and he'd believed her enough to call up and ask if I'd see her. Part of me wanted to say no, to keep this sanctuary completely separate from the toxicity I'd escaped, but another part of me, maybe the part that had been waiting for this moment, said yes and told him to send her up. Before I tell you what happened when she walked through that door, make sure you're subscribed and drop a like because this confrontation is everything you're hoping it will be and more. I stood by the window, deliberately positioned so the view would be the first thing she saw, and I waited with my heart pounding but my spine straight, ready for whatever was about to unfold. When Claire stepped out of the private elevator into my foyer, her face went through about 5 different expressions in the span of 3 seconds: confusion, shock, disbelief, something that might have been anger, and finally a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked around at the soaring ceilings, the designer furniture, the original artwork on the walls, the floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the city like a painting, and I watched her trying to reconcile what she was seeing with the narrative she'd constructed about who I was. "Ava," she said, her voice unnaturally high. "What is this place? Are you house-sitting for someone?" Even now, even faced with undeniable evidence, her first instinct was to assume this couldn't possibly be mine, that there had to be some explanation that kept me in the box she'd built for me. I smiled, genuinely amused by how predictable she was, and said, "No, Claire, this is my home. I bought it 3 weeks ago. Would you like a tour?" The look on her face was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. It wasn't just surprise. It was the complete collapse of a worldview she'd invested decades into maintaining. She walked through the penthouse like she was in a museum, touching things tentatively as if they might disappear, asking questions that got progressively more desperate. "How did you afford this? Did you marry someone rich? Did you win the lottery?" Each question was really the same question underneath. How did you become successful when I spent so much time convincing everyone, including you, that you never would be? I didn't answer directly at first. I just let her sit with the cognitive dissonance of seeing me in a space that cost more than she made in 5 years, living a life that contradicted every prediction she'd ever made about my future. Finally, she sat down on my cream-colored sofa, without asking, which was so typical, and said the words I'd been waiting to hear. "Ava, I don't understand. You were always... how did this happen?" And that's when I decided it was time to tell her exactly how her always failing little sister had ended up here. For a moment, as Claire sat there on my sofa staring at me like I was a stranger, I just let the silence stretch between us, heavy and uncomfortable, in a way she clearly wasn't used to. This was the same sister who'd spent years filling every quiet moment with a reminder of my supposed failures, and now she couldn't find a single word that made sense in the face of my reality. I walked over to the coffee table, picked up the neatly organized folder I'd prepared days earlier, just in case this moment ever came, and placed it in front of her. If you've ever fantasized about the day someone who doubted you has to face the truth, hit that subscribe button and leave a like, because this was that day for me. "You want to know how this happened?" I said calmly. "Start with those." She opened the folder, and her eyes immediately widened as she recognized the letterhead on the trust document, the estate lawyer's name, and finally my grandmother's handwriting on the letters. I watched the color drain from her face as she flipped through page after page, seeing in real time what I'd seen in that storage unit, the trust in my name, the instructions that I was supposed to be told at 18, the correspondence between our parents and the lawyer asking to delay and manage the funds. "You weren't supposed to find these," she muttered under her breath, then caught herself and looked up at me, panic flickering in her eyes. Mom and Dad were going to tell you eventually. You weren't ready back then. You were a mess, Ava. You needed guidance." I laughed, not a bitter, broken laugh, but a clear, steady one that surprised even me. "Guidance?" I repeated. "Is that what you call keeping me broke, dependent, and convinced I was incompetent while sitting on money that could have changed my life?" Claire's defensiveness kicked in hard, like it always did when her control was threatened. "We were trying to protect you," she said, her voice rising. "You were always so fragile. You couldn't handle responsibility. You still can't. This place is insane, Ava. You're being reckless. You don't know what you're doing." But the words didn't land like they used to. They bounced off the solid sense of self I'd built without her. I walked to the window, gesturing at the skyline, at the penthouse, at everything around us. "The thing is, Claire," I said, turning back to her, All of this says I do know what I'm doing. The business, the investments, the property, those weren't accidents. They were choices, good ones. And the only reason you still think I'm incapable is because you need me to stay that way for your story about yourself to make sense. Her mouth opened and closed, searching for a comeback, but there wasn't one that could survive in the face of evidence this overwhelming. For the first time in my life, I watched Claire realize that she was no longer the authority on who I was. As the afternoon light shifted across the living room, the conversation turned from denial to something that almost sounded like desperation. Claire tried a new angle, leaning into victimhood. "Do you have any idea how hard I've worked?" she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't get anything handed to me. I had to earn every promotion, every bonus. And now you just find out you're rich and skip all the hard parts?" I shook my head, not angry, just tired. "That's where you're wrong," I told her. "The money didn't erase the hard parts. It just made it possible for me to stop living under the hard parts you and mom and dad created. You had support, encouragement, belief. I had sabotage dressed up as advice. We did not play the same game." She didn't respond, and in that silence, something inside me finally snapped loose from her completely. I realized I no longer needed her to admit what she'd done or apologize in a way that satisfied me. I didn't need her validation, her approval, or even her understanding. I had something so much more powerful than all of that, a life that proved she'd been wrong about me. After she left, taking the elevator down from the home she never expected I'd own, I stood alone in my living room and let the quiet wrap around me like a blanket. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who believed she was broken because that's what her family needed her to believe. And I wished I could reach back in time and tell her, "You are not defective. You are just surrounded by people who benefit from you staying small." Being labeled the weak one had never actually meant I was weak. It had meant I was being perceived in a way that kept everyone else comfortable. My grandmother had seen through that and invested in who I really was, not who they said I was. And it took finding those documents for me to finally see myself the way she had. Now, standing in my penthouse, with my business thriving and my sense of self no longer up for debate, I understood something important. You don't owe anyone a performance of the broken version of yourself they're used to. You're allowed to outgrow the role they wrote for you. You're allowed to win quietly, loudly, or however you choose, as long as you're winning on your own terms. So if you're listening to this thinking about all the times someone told you that you'd fail like always, remember this. Their prediction is not your destiny. It's a reflection of their limits, not yours. The moment you stop accepting their narrative and start testing your own potential, everything can change. Maybe not overnight, and maybe not with a $3 million penthouse at the end of it, but with a life that feels honest, free, and fully yours. And when you finally rise, you don't have to drag anyone to your level or prove anything to people committed to misunderstanding you. You can just live. You can just be. And sometimes, the sweetest revenge isn't a dramatic confrontation or a perfect comeback. It's building a life so aligned with who you really are that their opinion of you becomes completely irrelevant. After hearing my story, what would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted your family the moment you found those documents, or quietly built your own life the way I did? Do you think my parents and Claire were trying to protect me in their own twisted way? Or was it pure control and insecurity dressed up as concern? And more importantly, what's your take on this kind of revenge? The kind where you don't ruin anyone else's life, you just stop letting them ruin yours? Do you believe revenge ever truly brings peace? Or is the real peace found in detaching and moving on? Was I wrong for not telling my family sooner? For using what was mine without asking their permission? For letting them see the result instead of inviting them into the process? Let me know in the comments what you would have done differently. And if you've ever had to break free from a story your family wrote about you that didn't fit who you really are. If you want more stories like this, about betrayal, hidden truths, and unexpected comebacks, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. In the next video, there's an even crazier story about a woman whose mother-in-law tried to steal her business idea and ended up working for her without even realizing it at first. You're not going to want to miss that one. I'll see you in the next video.